He's Chad Sowash. And I want you to help me welcome to the stage the man, the myth, we call him the commish, the Ayatollah of rock and Rolla, Keith Sonderling.
Oh, man.
Too early? Too early?
These are the guys you want waking you up in the morning.
And also sixth in our fantasy football league.
That's
just
right.
So you know.
Now that I can do it, I'm not in the federal government anymore, so I can engage in your gambling activities.
He gets to play. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right. Is that too much?
Wide awake.
Good.
I love it. That's good. Coffee. Everybody have the drinks. Come on in, everybody.
Plenty of seats.
We've saved the best for last.
Let's meet Keith, shall we?
Yeah.
Who is Keith Sonderling?
I don't know anymore.
You don't know anymore? Say more about that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Keith Sonderling. I just finished up being the commissioner at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where I was there for 4 years. Before that, I was at the Department of Labor. I was the deputy and also the acting wage and hour administrator. I was there for 3 years. And before joining the government in 2017, I was a labor and employment defense attorney in Florida. So I've lived this world. I know your world, both from being on your side, being on the other side. So I have a unique perspective across two agencies that I know outside of your federal contracting practice also you have to deal with all the time.
So no pressure, but Jeremy, you weren't here on day one, I know, because you're a busy guy. But he said the reason we have the former EEOC guy is because he's not tied to the script. He's going to name names. He's going to be open and honest. So no pressure, but the groundwork has been laid.
Right. Chatham House rules, not recording at all.
Right.
Yes, because we're a podcast. We don't record stuff.
He just got really nervous.
So how does it feel to be out?
It's nice. I'm not really out because I'm still coming to HR conferences and I just can't get enough to talk about HR compliance at 8 a.m. in the morning on a Thursday.
You lucky bastard. So why don't we go ahead and start talking about trends? Start talking about trends, what you've seen. I mean, you know, they're at the EEOC.
Yeah, so you know, the EEOC is unique in the sense where it applies to all industries, whether or not you're a federal contractor, and both the private sector, state and local, and federal government. So, you know, really from DC at the EEOC, we're in a position to see what all the trends are in HR across industry, across the country. Because whether you know it or not, you know, employees cannot go directly to court, whether you're state, federal, or a private sector employer, have to come to the EEOC. So we literally see every single case of discrimination, and it puts us in a position, you know, to come out here and actually talk to you what those are, to get ahead of it and see what the trends are, you know, where things are going and where things have been, which is what I really want to talk about this morning. So if you look at the state of employment discrimination going back to I like to start around 2008 to 2010 after the recession. We saw a huge spike in discrimination claims. So between 2010 and 2012, it was record high discrimination charges every single year, around 100,000 plus charges at the federal level. And you look back and say, you know, why did this happen? Because at the time it's a little different than now, where people lost their jobs, you know, after the economy tanked. And there wasn't really anywhere else to go. You couldn't find a remote job paying more at that point. So a lot of people were coming to the EEOC. So we saw a lot of recessionary era discrimination claims that made those so high. And then looking specifically at that, where we came out of that, you know, it was a lot of age discrimination because a lot of the reduction in workforces impacted older workers because they were being paid more, and it's an easy metrics to use.
Was that the biggest chunk that you saw?
Yeah, it was a very large chunk. Well, it was just across the board, but age certainly was impacted significantly. So then, you know, like for all of you as HR compliance professionals, you know, even at the EEOC, there's a lot of distractions. So say, okay, now we need to focus on age discrimination because that was what happened coming out of the recession. And the next thing you know, the Me Too movement happens, right? So around like 2015, 2016. So then it's all about sexual harassment in the workplace, preventing it, enforcing those cases. And then we saw record sexual harassment cases at the time. And then, you know, you start focusing on that. And then the U.S. women's soccer team makes global news about not being paid equally.
Parity.
And then it's all about pay equity. And then COVID happens. And it's all about, you know, accommodations and vaccinations, and then George Floyd, and then it's all about racial discrimination. So there's always something, too, like all your professions, where you have to shift your resources there across the board. So anyway, that historically, from where we were, in the early 2010s of that 100,000, right before the pandemic, discrimination was really, really going down. And so like around 2019-ish, early 2020, the charge of discrimination went all the way down from that 100,000 peak to around 63,000. And I looked at it as a really good thing. And less discrimination is good. That means all of you in HR are being
I've been told, yes.
empowered to be able to actually do your jobs, and employees are feeling that they're able to come and file a charge of discrimination or talk to HR to remedy it. And other people's, and we'll talk about the political nature of this area, and other people are saying, well, there must be some other reasons for it. Maybe they're just going to get another job. Maybe they don't feel comfortable, and that systemic discrimination is going to occur. Whatever the reason was, it started really significantly to go down. But since then, and the pandemic played a large role in this to where we are today, it's creeping up every single year. So it went from 63,000 to 67,000, and then another big jump in the 70,000s to where this past fiscal year, it was at 81,000. So we're going in the wrong direction. Charges of discrimination are starting to go up again, and we're starting to see a lot of discrimination complaints, almost now 20,000 more than we were a few years ago.
What's the flavor of those? Have the flavor
And this
changed?
is where it's so difficult. And it's so dependent upon what's going on. So if you look, everyone wanted to know, how did COVID impact discrimination claims?
Yeah.
In the middle of it, right? So I get there, and then everyone's like, it's the middle of COVID, tell us what charges are coming in related to COVID. And it's really difficult in this area too, because as you all know, employees generally have 300 days to file a charge of discrimination alleging employment discrimination. And then, unfortunately, you wouldn't be in HR if you haven't seen a charge of discrimination against your company or seen that form. On there, it only has, sex, age, religion, national origin. So everyone during COVID is saying, well, what's happening? And there wasn't a box for COVID discrimination, right? So we actually had to see when those cases came in and then actually do some investigations to see what the issues are. But you talk about, something globally and how it impacts employment discrimination. The big takeaway from COVID was religious discrimination. And we had an additional 10,000 charges of religious discrimination related to the vaccine mandates. And then that all required everyone in HR to suddenly not only be in the business of having to put these policies out to mandate vaccines in areas outside of healthcare for the first time, but for the first time, again, outside of healthcare, HR departments had to question their employees' faith, because every employee who didn't want to get the vaccine suddenly became very religious, went on the internet for $30 and got
Don't we all?
And got the letter from the Church of Internet saying, I'm religious, even though you have their social media accounts and you're friends with them, and they do very unholy.
We started the church.
Unholy things.
We started the Church of Ched.
Right, exactly. For $30, get that. But in all seriousness, it just shows where you don't know which area is going to be the next hotspot, and because of that, the year before the COVID vaccines, religious charges were only 3.4% of all charges. The next year, it went to 19% of all charges nationwide. So you get to see something like that. Just can explode, and it completely shifts the dynamics of what the most amount of claims are that year, which also drives where you need to spend money internally within your organizations on compliance. So it's so keeping up with these trends that's so important, and also getting ahead of some of those issues.
So if we're looking at trends going forward, and one of the things we talk a lot on the show about is the return-to-office phenomenon.
Yeah.
And I want to say the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act was recent. Was
Yep.
that a part of the return to office, and are we going to see more sort of return to office cases come into play as companies make workers go back?
Yeah, so this is the hottest issue still across the board in HR, no matter what industry you're in, is the return to office policies. And just to set the groundwork, because there's so much confusion about where employees are allowed to work and how we got here. And just taking a step back, everyone needs to know, outside of an executive contract or a collective bargaining agreement, employees have no right to work from home. You all, and we've lost sense of this, that all of you still control, it's a legal term, the essential functions of the job. So if you want your employees in the office 7 days a week from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., you can demand that. Will they all immediately quit? Absolutely. But just don't lose sight of the fact that if you believe it's necessary for your business to people to come to the office, you are still allowed to do that in HR. And I think we've lost some of that with the whole employee experience and, in the shifting dynamics.
And wanting to keep really good talent. Yeah, no.
Yeah, I mean, all that.
We've lost a lot of that, yeah.
Yeah, but that's just let me just be a lawyer for a minute. I'm just saying you can do whatever you want.
So what he's saying is
you'll deal
he
with
wants to be less of a human. He's going to be a lawyer.
Right. You could deal with the consequences later. But in all seriousness, now as we see a lot of companies, especially in New York City and big cities, finance, tech in California are demanding these return to office policies.
Yeah.
It's really causing a lot of issues within the workplace, both for HR professionals who have to administer them, but for these employees, a lot of them who you recruited to be remotely. So people are very curious about where the law comes into this. And really, for the most part, employees just don't have that federally protected right to work from home. However, and this is where it's so important about the trends and where things are going, employees are starting to get that right. And let me step back for a moment to understand, again, to this conversation about the amount of charges that come in and how things shift over time. So I'm going to detour here to what I see the biggest trend in HR right now is disability discrimination. And
which could go hand in hand with remote work.
Yep.
That's why you're getting. That's exactly where I'm going.
Okay.
That's why you're a good interviewer.
Let him go.
Reading my mind. So if you look at disability discrimination, generally it's the #1 cause of discrimination every single year at the EEOC. Does anyone know what the actual #1 underlying cause of discrimination is at the EEOC every year? Retaliation. Very good. This is a sophisticated crowd, though. It's not fair. So retaliation is the #1 cause every single year across all labor agencies, not just at EEOC, at Wage and Hour, at DOL, at National Labor Relations Board, which is why a lot of employee groups think that the charge numbers are lower than they should be because retaliation is the #1 charge. But disability discrimination generally is the #1 underlying cause of discrimination every single year. And the dynamics of disability discrimination are changing so drastically. Where we think about disability discrimination historically, what do we think about? Employees with illnesses, employees with physical disabilities, employees recovering from all sorts of diseases, and HR departments have gotten really good about the accommodations in that process, whether it's through JAN or a lot of these other services. That if somebody is missing a limb, you know exactly how to deal with that and what adaptive equipment you need to buy. But we've seen such a shift from physical disabilities to mental health in the charges that we've seen, to the point where if you look at all of our disability claims, right now, 36% of all Americans with Disability Act claims that come to the EEOC are related to mental health. And think about all of the illnesses, all the diseases out there, everything that would qualify somebody for a disability accommodation, 36% of that is related to mental health. And the big drivers of that, the big three, which is almost 30% of that, is anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Technically, our categories of mental health, anxiety, PTSD, depression, schizophrenia, cumulative trauma disorder, and manic depressive disorder, and then kind of a catch-all. So out of the anxiety, depression, and PTSD, that's almost 29% of all the charges in the ADA last year. And to put that in perspective, in fiscal year 1993, anxiety, depression, and PTSD was 0.1% of the ADA charges. Now it's 30%, right? So this is where things are going, and there's a lot of drivers to where we're getting here. Going back to the return to work, what we're now seeing is companies are mandating come back to the office 4 days a week, 5 days a week, and employees are saying, well, I can't. Well, yes, you can. Get to the office. No, I have anxiety about my commute. I'm worried about getting the next virus if I ride the subway. Some of these cities are not safe anymore, and I have anxiety about potentially getting mugged outside of the office, or I'm depressed at the fact of having to go back to the office and BS with my colleagues at the water cooler when I've been in my pajamas locked in the basement, and we've had record profits. Why are you doing this to me?
He's been watching you.
Right? Yeah. You just look like that every day.
Wow.
Haven't shaved in a year, and all this stuff.
See what we have to put up with?
But they're coming. They're saying, "Why are you doing this?" You're impacting my mental health. And I can't, I have PTSD about returning to the old way in this new work environment. Like, basically, why are you doing this to me? And employers are coming forward, and they're saying, I can't come back to the office because I'm disabled under the Americans with Disability Act, and you have to accommodate me. And here's where I'm seeing the biggest issue. For all of you in HR, your mandate, especially from these very large, well-known companies, the CEOs on TV, the boards, they're saying to the CHROs, we want everyone back in the office and get that plan to back in the office. So now in HR, you're being graded in a sense of how quickly you're returning people to the office. And there's a tension there with the ability to actually do your job and be empowered to say, well, if you are claiming you're disabled under the Americans with Disability Act, what is your disability? We need to engage in the interactive process and go through all that. But what you're seeing is such a rush to get in there where, whether or not you're believing the employee, just not even engaging in that process because you need to get everyone back to the office is causing a lot of claims under the ADA of not engaging in that process. And the reason I see that a lot of HR departments or companies are unwilling to do this is because they think the employee is going to win. So every time if an employee comes through and I have a mental health issue, I can't come back to the office, I want to work remotely, if you don't dive into it, you may think, well, the only accommodation we can do if we go through this process is to allow them to work from home. Mm-hmm. And that's not true. To go, say we both have anxiety, mm-hmm. and the analysis of what that accommodation, we both have anxiety, we go to HR, we both want to work from home, right? That's the only cure. And the analysis is actually much different, not only working with your own medical providers, with their medical providers, because of course they're going to come with the accommodation to work from home from their provider. And it's going through that analysis saying, well, you have this type of anxiety, I have this type of anxiety. For me to be able to work with that, with an accommodation, would be maybe noise canceling Bose headsets. For you, it'd be working in a dim light area, right? So going through that process, which you all know very well, may actually lead you to give them accommodation where they're allowed to perform the essential functions of their job with their disability, absent working from home, and actually coming to the office. And look, the employees may not like that, but from your legal obligation, that's sort of where it ends. And we're not seeing that now because of this just rush to come back.
So no plan.
And these pressures.
There's
right?
no plan. It's just get them in.
And the plan is going back to basics to what you would do with any other type of disability, but there's just such pressures now on HR to do this, and it's really driving a lot of the mental health issues.
I mean, forgive me for saying get off my lawn, but this sounds like a generational problem. Can you break down what we're seeing?
I don't think so.
This sounds like a millennial problem.
Well, actually, it's funny because the next driver of mental health is related to the Gen Z in the workforce.
Of course it is.
Which is, and that's the attitude I'm going to give you a prime example of. You do not want Joel interacting with your Gen Zs to do the interactive process.
You do not.
I can second that.
Because the next driver of mental health is just this multi-generational workforce. I think there was a stat recently, there's more Gen Zs in the workforce now than the boomer generations are one of them where they're really exploding.
Millennial.
Yeah, it's getting pretty significant. And just the way, they're working, work has changed. They've always started on their phone. They're much more technologically advanced and they want a much different lifestyle. And they're leading with their mental health, which other generations never did.
Stuff it down.
So what we're seeing now is claims from Gen Z related to their mental health that really HR departments need to be equipped with regardless of how the claim sounds. So everything from, and I'll use Joel as the mean manager here, so I'm Gen Z and I come to Joel and say, Joel, I have a lot of anxiety about my yearly performance review because I feel like I'm going to get a bad review. Mm-hmm. And I need an accommodation not to have a yearly performance review. Please accommodate me.
This is when I say rub some dirt on it and get back
Exactly.
out.
Okay, so we all laughed, ha ha ha, and you're not going to laugh when the EEOC charge comes. And let me tell you why. As ridiculous as that may sound, and nobody's going to argue that it's not a part of your job to get a performance review, or, in all seriousness, we've all seen claims saying, I can't take more than one assignment at once, I can't work past 5 p.m. on Wednesdays because that's when I have my yoga classes. Just the absurdity of some of these coming in, which may sound ridiculous to certain generations, right? Like I can't take more than one assignment. Yes, that wouldn't have worked before. Or this, I don't want a performance review. If you laugh it off and they're saying, it's related to, I'm anxious about this, I'm depressed about this, you still have to go through that process. As ridiculous as the claims may sound to you, if they're being genuine about it, you still have to go through that and say, is there an accommodation for not having a performance review? And the answer is going to be no, you have to have a performance review. But if you completely blow by that process, and this is where it really takes a lot of training outside of HR. Like, you can sort of in HR, even though we all laughed, and I laughed too, at this accommodation, and you're all HR professionals. Imagine what a manager, somewhere in the middle of the country is going, at a factory is going to be there.
Gonna sound like that.
Gonna sound like this guy and look like this guy.
What did I do?
Maybe they'll shave, but
Damn.
hold
Wasn't like this.
He was not like this before.
He's nasty.
you could like beat me up now. And there's nothing I can do about it.
I know. Now you're fighting back.
Before it would be a federal crime. So. But in all seriousness, it really goes to outside of HR now, going to those managers and really having that kind of generational training, or it's just going to lead to these claims, even though they weren't actually entitled to an accommodation, but they were entitled to go through that process. And the good thing is that's what all of you as HR professionals know best. It's just whether it's the remote work, whether it's these Gen Z issues, it's going back to the fundamentals of engaging in those processes, as ridiculous as it sounds to you, because if you don't, you're really going to have no defense to that. And then the other part of this too, which on the whole manager training outside of your offices as well, what we are seeing is that there's teams where say you have a group of 5, a team of 5 people and a manager. So 2 of the 5 people request an accommodation to work from home. They actually have a reason to work from home. Doctors approved. That's the only accommodation you give them. HR actually gives them the accommodation, which occurs. And then the manager and then the rest of the 3 members are in the office, and everyone's just sitting on their computers on Zoom or Teams, right, in a conference room, because these 2 people aren't there, but everyone's in front of their computers or sitting in front of their office. It ends. And the other employee saying, oh, it's really not fair that Chad gets to work from home, and we're here. And then manager Joel goes, well, Chad just, you claim you're crazy too, you can go get an accommodation, right? Like, why don't you just go tell HR you're crazy, I don't want to be here either, But like, look, these are not trained HR professionals.
Yeah.
And that's happening. And what that does, in a sense, where that manager should be trained and say, there's a process to request an accommodation in this company, through our handbook, through HR. If you feel like you need an accommodation, you need to go to HR. Versus the reality of it, say, yeah, it sucks, I'm here too. I'm the manager, I don't want to be here, we're just sitting on Teams. It's not fair either. And then that's going to be not only a disclosure of, unlawful disclosure of medical information, a interfering with their leave. So you get to see how it can spiral out of control way outside of your HR organization, even though you've done everything right on that side too. So
what about all these people who were hired to be remote and they were disabled beforehand, and now they're being thrust back into the office?
Yeah, and this is another big question about, especially during COVID, where a lot of, especially, for tech companies.
Well, we saw the other day, for individuals with disabilities, like they're at the best hiring rate they've been. It's like 7.
Because of that work from home accommodation.
Yeah. And then we've got employers saying, get the hell back in the office. Like, I wasn't in the office in the first place.
Yeah, and this goes to the point before where I said that even if you're outside executives, right, that have those very long contracts generally drafted by lawyers that HR professionals generally don't see, for the most of your employees, especially the ones that you recruited during COVID to work, from here in Louisiana when the company's in Silicon Valley, those are just offer letters. And again, the employer can still change the job requirements. So, you've seen people who've been out in Costa Rica living a nice life and saying, if you're not in the office in Oregon on Monday, you're fired. And they could sort of do that in that sense as well, because they can change that. So you're starting to see that as well. And, employees want to know what their legal rights are there. Not many, right? And, but this is where if they say, well, I can't because of a disability, I wouldn't have applied to this job. If I didn't have this accommodation, it's not really an accommodation, I wouldn't have applied to this job. And they have to start that process fresh and saying, well, even though I've been working remote from home, that hasn't been an accommodation, it was just part of the job, I'm unable to return to the office because of this and going through that process. And again, you all see the news too. The fear here is that it's just happening so quickly across the boards. And when it's, the CEOs on TV saying everyone's back in the office, it's and they want it quickly, these violations start occurring.
So what about, wait, real quick, what about in the same vein, you have a lot of these employees that are like, I'm not coming back, because it feels like almost a forced layoff at some point where people are just going to quit.
You think?
That's what companies are looking for, right? They're looking for, instead of paying severance, they just want them to quit. But there are employees that are out there saying, no, you hired me from here, I'm working from here, fire me.
And they'll get fired.
It just seems...
Unless they can show it has a disparate impact on a certain group, or what we've seen, or targeting a certain group. We just want to get rid of this team, and this team is mainly of this race, this national origin. You'd have to get into these more complicated, is there intentionality there, or is there a disparate impact?
Why you need a plan.
Right, I mean, this is really going through these so you don't have that. And we'll talk about with some of when we get into the technology stuff, for older workers and disabled workers, there's going to be significant impact there as well. But yeah, no, to your point about having a plan and going back, and as complicated as all these new challenges are, whether it was with COVID, whether it's with these working from home, or as we'll discuss technology, it's really going back to the basics and going back to sort of the boring part of what you've done, and these same processes just apply to these newer issues, but sometimes we lose sight of that.
So you touched on technology, and we'll get to that in a second. The political winds are raging, and I'm just curious your take on a Kamala presidency versus a Trump presidency. What can we kind of expect to see at the EEOC?
Talk about trends, Jesus.
Yeah, so I think that HR is going to continue to be in the spotlight, and it's just really fascinating to see how these issues are now front and center in Washington, D.C. It wasn't always like this, and you'll hear from Craig after. For most people, going into these political positions like we did, working at the Department of Labor, working at the EEOC, it's not necessarily the most elite thing, like going to the Department of Justice or Treasury or any of these, other agencies, historically. But there's just been such a switch in that, where labor and employment issues are really top of mind in D.C. And it started too with obviously President Biden being the most pro-union, candidate and president. And then even if you look, at the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee that oversees the EEOC, DOL, NLRB, Bernie Sanders is the chair of that committee, and that's a job he wanted his entire career in the Senate because it deals with health, education, and labor. So there's just a lot of scrutiny now from both sides on employment practices, post-pandemic. So I think it's going to continue with that. I think that's just the shifts of what the focuses are going to be different, whether it's Harris or Trump, and even different than Biden, where Biden, the Biden administration was just so heavy on traditional labor and unions and strikes and, being involved in that process and unionization. And, you've all seen the explosion of unionization across industries that were the last you'd ever think to be unionized, because they're the ones with the ping pong tables and the cafes and all this stuff where, outside of the traditional where you would see labor. So I don't think, if Harris wins, that it's not necessarily that will go away, but I think there'll be a big shift for her from that kind of old school, like I like to say, old school Detroit unions and strikes and unionizations to much more back in this world of the things that she was interested in, like pay equity, racial discrimination. More of the core practices here, I think, will be in a much bigger spotlight if she wins. With the paid family leave initiatives and pay equity initiatives, and really going back and rooting out racial discrimination, kind of focus in some of the gender issues there. Where if former President Trump wins, you have a record to see what he did when he was in office, and it was a lot more technical business regulations that were occurring then and that will occur again, like dealing with independent contracting issues, dealing with joint employers issues, franchisee and franchisor liability, a lot of those more structural business foundation regulations to make it easier for businesses.
Reinsert NDAs?
Well, maybe. Things like that. But no, I don't want to say it's much more technical in that sense of what the initial priorities, I believe, over there will be. Like the overtime threshold and things like that, just changing some of those. But across the board too, I still think there'll be a lot of interest too. And I think even and I'm sure it's been discussed in this conference, like with the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, I think both, whoever wins, it's going to continue. Where if Harris wins, it's going to be still continue a push on DE&I on one side, and if Trump wins, you'll see some of the advocacy groups having a DE&I push on the other side, relating to some reverse discrimination claims.
How about headcount and funding? Do you see one candidate putting more resources into it versus another? Because under Biden, we've had more money and more resources put in. If Trump gets in, do you see that pulling back, or do you see it?
Well, a lot of that depends on Congress too, and how much, on the makeup of Congress. If it's a Democrat-led Congress, these agencies will get a lot more money, even though they've been kind of flat the last few years, just from dynamics. If Republicans control everything, what you'll see is probably more of a flat line budget, but the additional resources will go to compliance, assistance, and training, less on the investigator side and more on the outreach side. So generally you see the shifts in Democrat administration, hire a lot more investigators, hire a lot more lawyers. Republican administrations, you hire more people to do some of the compliance outreach and less on the investigatory side, and you see those numbers going down on the actual amount of frontline
More education, less enforcement.
Generally, leading with education versus enforcement versus, in Democrat administrations, leading with enforcement and then doing the education after. It's been pretty consistent no matter who the president was, going back decades on how Republicans look at enforcement and how Democrats look at enforcement.
Democrats are the...
Should we get into tech?
Yep, go ahead and roll that beautiful bean footage. How do you guys know what the hell you're looking for in the first place?
With a lot of companies saying, hey, wait a minute, we've never even thought about the dangers of what we just purchased.
Conversational AI is a transformative technology. All you have to do is talk.
Let's talk about trust real quick, because you blew up the whole system.
But also for the candidates itself to not be discriminated against. And that's new, and that's a benefit.
No, I think the future looks seamless.
There's really a great opportunity here to give individuals a much better experience.
So as you can see, we take Keith Sonderling wherever we go. Jesus, yeah.
He's the secret to our success.
Yeah, so needless to say, we talk a lot about AI, and it was amazing because I had a chief of staff reached out to me of an EEOC commissioner to talk about AI. And this is three years ago, 4 years ago. I'm like, you're full of shit. The EEOC doesn't know how to spell AI. This is not a thing. So we,
So it's hard to spell.
we sit down with Keith and we start having the discussions, and we start having these I've worked with the EEOC and OFCCP for 10 years plus, and I've never had these higher technical conversations. We're talking about mainframes. We're talking about basic stuff. So it was great. I had great conversations, and we're able to start talking about things on the government side of the house that I've been trying to get many of these conferences to talk about for years now. AI, it's coming. And now that it's here, everybody, they're having
freaking out.
They're having problems.
Freaking
right?
out.
And as you saw from the presentations the other day, you've got CEOs, 70% of those are like, yes, we're going full forward with AI. How many companies in here today have already started to institute automation and AI into your hiring practices?
I'm not in the government. You can raise your hand.
Yeah.
It's fine. I can't do anything anymore.
So thank you. For all of you who did not raise your hands, I bet you are. I bet you already are, and you don't even know it. 2 weeks ago, we were in Scottsdale, and we were talking to tons of major brands. And you saw GM, Eileen Kowalski from GM there. General Motors, not a small organization, right? They did some amazing efficiency work with technology, AI, automation, saved millions of dollars. We were having conversations with the global VP of talent acquisition. No compliance people were around, right? But she had to go through that process, even though, again, a lot of the tech that we're seeing today is starting to automatically push automation, efficiencies, and it's just baked into the system. So this is, for us, one of the most important areas. from an education standpoint, and that's exactly what Keith was trying to do. So
It's
why
full of risk, isn't it, Keith?
Why in the first place? Why did you make that call? Why did AI matter?
Set the table
to
for
you?
AI.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about these trends, where I started, I wanted to get ahead of it when I got there and say, what are the next big issues impacting AI? And it's very hard. Excuse me, the next big issues impacting HR. And that's where I learned about AI, because it's very hard with all these things going on to focus on something in the future when you literally can't deal with what you have on your plate that day. And I didn't know anything, about this kind of software. I didn't know anything about this whole industry, and that's when I learned. And through reaching out to a lot of people in the industry, really how prolific it is being used within the HR function, not to, and this was 2020, 2021, not to displace workers in that conversation now, but just to actually do core functions that HR professionals have been doing, all with the promise not just to do it more efficiently and effectively than all of you humans in the room, but without bias. And I was like, okay, now that's where we can get involved, because a lot of the vendors out there at the time, if you remember early on, were just saying this is a bias-free solution to use AI instead of your human recruiters to get perfect diversity, equity, inclusion, to get
Famous last words, by the
hiring.
way.
And if you remember really early on, they were saying, and we're certified by the EOC and OFCCP, and EOC and OFCCP doesn't certify anybody, as you all know. But using some of these old standard tests in the aggregate, kind of playing with that. So I would say this is worth getting involved. And you get involved and you realize it's just really every function that HR professionals do, there's AI software out there, promising to do it better. And that's where I thought it was really important to get in, because in looking at it, and it's extremely complicated. So many people are just getting lost in how the technology works, and trying to keep up with what is AI, how does it actually work in the HR function. And what I found was all the vendors in this space and all the people investing in this space, they all have one thing in common. And I know you know all of them. And was that they've never worked in HR.
Yeah.
They're very smart, entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley that sees HR as a function that they've only dealt with from the outside, and saying, oh, that's something we can automate. That's something we can, make a product to do better. The difference about using AI in HR versus other areas in your business where they're coming from is that when you're dealing with AI and HR, you're dealing with fundamental civil rights. And that's the ability to enter and thrive in the workforce, provide for your family without being discriminated against by a human or an algorithm. Yeah. So that's really why it was so important to spend so much time here to go through each one of these softwares and tools, and just to take a step back. And where I've kind of just simplified all of this is saying, at the end of the day, all these AI tools that are being sold to you, that you've bought, been using, at the end of the day, they're, what is the employment decision you're using them to help you with, assist, or make, right? Because that is what we're going to look at, and that's what the law requires to be fair. So, what are the results of these decisions? And then we can sort of backtrack from there, how you got there versus how it's compared to what your functions are now without using technology. But there's only a finite amount of employment decisions, right? Hiring, firing, wages, training, promotions, demotions. And that's really what these tools are getting involved in, and that's what we regulate, and that's what you all know. So throwing in so many layers of technology has caused so much chaos and confusion, saying we don't understand this, we don't even understand our function anymore, because all these products and tools are being designed to do it better, but what are they actually to do? So I've kind of flipped the narrative, saying, it's no longer a question, are you going to use this in HR? We need to go back and rephrase it and saying, what are we using it for? Mm-hmm. What are our existing practices? How is this going to potentially make it better from removing bias, or is it going to actually increase potential discrimination? And at the end of the day, what is the results of those tools? Because that's what the EEOC looks at, that's what the OFCCP looks at, that's what judges and courts are going to look at, and show me the results. Less about all the numbers, how you got there, but let's look at the results, because that's what you all know, and that's what the process you already have in place.
Outcomes.
So we had some pretty high-profile cases early on. Amazon had their own sort of homemade AI that they actually canceled because they did see bias in their efforts. We saw a HireView case in Illinois, and a lot of laws we saw getting passed and legislation. To me, and we talk about this pretty frequently, it seems like things have kind of died down, but I know that you live this stuff every day. Are we still seeing laws passed at a state, local level? Have things cooled down? Should we expect some sort of federal guidance on this issue?
Yeah, and that's where I got involved early in just saying, well, so many people were hesitant about using this technology because all there's new proposals and these new laws and we don't know how to comply with them, or there's no federal laws yet. Maybe we can use it quickly. And that's just not true, because at the end of the day, what I've said is that there's an employment decision, right? And that's what's being regulated. Whether or not there's new laws from states, the EEOC is still regulating your use of AI or humans through the employment decision, right? And that's really ultimately what the law is always going to look at. But that doesn't ignore that there's a lot of pushes for additional requirements on AI, whether it's transparency, whether it's auditing, which is getting done by the states, which is getting even more confusing, because in certain states, like for Illinois was the first state to pass an AI law within HR, saying it's almost impossible to use facial recognition, stemming from some of the cases you mentioned, and you have to do all these disclosures. It's just so difficult to use it. And then Maryland followed. And then everyone knows in New York City they had their local law 144, which then required, if you're going to use it in New York City, to do a pre-deployment audit and to do a yearly bias audit. So if you look at some of these state and local laws, what are they asking to do? Like even in New York, and I know there's a lot of controversy around it, saying, okay, we'll do a bias audit. And that's something the EEOC has encouraged and something a lot of you do anyway with all your other hiring practices as well. So as these states and local governments try to put new requirements in there, or even what's going on in Europe with the EU AI Act, designating the use of AI in HR as higher risk, well, what does that require? It requires disclosure, doing a bias audit. So when states and foreign governments start poking around, saying, okay, well, how do you do a bias audit, right? Well, tell us New York, how do you do a bias audit? Tell us Brussels, how do you do bias audits? And then saying, look to the EEOC's 1978 guidelines on uniform employment selection procedures, right? So okay, thanks for nothing, right? Like dumping it back on us. But that shows, where your strength is there too, because, this is not new about how you actually do these underlying tests to see whether it's an employment assessment you're giving out or these AI tools have bias, and that's something you can get ahead of. So I don't necessarily, fear a lot of these state and local laws. I think it causes confusion because in New York, the bias audit only needs to be done for hiring and promotion for race, sex, and ethnicity. So that could lull you into thinking that you're in compliance in New York, but then because you've done that, but then for the federal government, well, if you're going to do an audit, the EEOC would then require, the other protected categories, age, religion, and then also more than just hiring and promotion, termination, just the whole, all the employment actions too. So you can see where it kind of gets a little choppy there too. So I think at some point, with all these states trying to get involved, it will even out, where you're going to see a lot of the requirements are going to be, maybe disclosure to candidates, disclosure to your employees, requiring that audit. All things you could voluntarily do now. Those are just how much do you want to get ahead of it in advance.
So the fun part is that this is really, so if you've been a job seeker since the internet, the process has become horrible. Takes half an hour to go through, actually apply for a job. But what we're seeing a lot of this AI push is also starting to restructure the whole thought process around talent acquisition and how we go after talent. How many of you hire without resumes? One.
No.
How many of you have different hiring processes technically, going through your technical system for somebody going into a management position versus a different departments? Do you have customized? Okay, so not a lot of you. Get ready. That's the next step. If I'm hiring frontline workers, they're not going to get on a laptop. Why do you have me filling out a form? That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. They're going to have a chat bot. And guess what? They love it. GM was talking about how they saved millions of dollars by changing the process. They don't need a resume. They just need to know what? Are you meeting the requirements?
Will you show up to work?
Yeah, wow. Do you meet the requirements? We've gone so far overboard that many talent acquisition professionals can't fill roles. They're losing great talent because we've layered in a bunch of attorney stuff.
And, I think... it's true, but you talk about the benefits of this because there's so much focusing on the risk. So let's just talk about that example now of forget a resume, forget, an interview with a person. Your entire experience is going to be on an app. And there's a lot of programs now, not just on the chat, that will do the entire interview through an app on your phone. And you think about what is the potential benefits of that is that the app can't see the color of your skin. It can't see if you're disabled. It can't see if you're pregnant. It can't see if you're wearing religious garb. So many people, historically, have gone into an interview, whether it's on Zoom in person, and what's the first thing that happens when you walk in an interview? You literally see everything about that person the EEOC says you're not allowed to make a hiring decision in. And for disabled workers in particularly, that hiring manager may say in the back of their mind, how much is this person going to cost me? How much accommodation is going to cost me pregnant? How much is leave? You're going to have to hire somebody else. And there's just been so many people who historically have not been able to get past that first step, even though they're qualified because of those biases. But the app can't see any of that. And forget the resume. If it's asking you to do a real life scenario of what it's like to work there, then for the first time you're being able to actually judge that candidate, not based necessarily what their background was, what the color of their skin or where they went to school, all these inherent biases there, and actually seeing if they're able to perform the job. So there's just so many people that stand to benefit from this that historically have not been able to get past that first step because of the AI not being able to see that. But then, of course, like anything else, I can flip it and tell you how that could potentially discriminate. It's really important, to look at that as well, because people want to say it's the best thing, and people want to say it's the worst thing, and it's neither. It's how you design it and how you use it. So let's say, some of these programs saying, here's a real life situation at our store. How would you respond to this? And a lot of times you have to dictate saying, here's how I would react. The customer is coming here, and here's how I've dealt with it before. And it uses natural language processing to go through your voice and rates you on the words you say in the order you say them to the employer's satisfaction. Again, a really good thing. But you go to the design of these tools, which are out of your control, which is you're relying on a vendor to actually build these. And like, for instance, if the person has a very thick foreign accent, and it can't pick up what they're saying versus us who speaks, fluent American English, that person with a really thick foreign accent may be giving a much better response than us, but it picks us up more than that person. So that's going to be national origin discrimination. Or if the person has a stutter or slurs, that could be disability discrimination at scale for all those people. So as you're giving these people now an equal opportunity, if the vendor can't account for that disability, can't account for that foreign accent, or to the example you gave before with the all women being excluded from the applicant pool because it was for a position that has historically 99% of the resumes are males. So if you're a female, you went to a women's college, you automatically got the lowest score. That wasn't a misogynistic intent on behalf of the algorithm, because it wasn't designed properly to see, well, there still must be some underlying skill to be able to do the job, male versus female, to be able to eliminate that. And that's a challenge for all of you, because you're not designing these tools. And you're buying them, and you're relying on the vendor to be able to account for those protected characteristics. And if they can't, you all are 100% liable for that mass discrimination against those people with foreign accents or those women who were excluded.
And the thing
Not the vendor, all of you.
And the thing is that we used to, unless you're in California where they might pull the vendor into that, but the hardest part is that we used to buy technology, set it and forget it. Put it in place, walk away. That is not going, the auditing process, the ensuring that we get a chance to actually take a look at outcomes very quickly, because the scale that happens is going to be much larger. What happens with scale? If there's any bias in that process whatsoever, before you might not have been able to see it because it was so minuscule, but then you start to scale it up, bias explodes. Not to mention things change. So now with this new technology, we're going to have to be more fluid. We can't just set it, walk away and forget it. Put our processes in place and think that we're done, because that's going to bite you in the ass.
And you have to also, the way this whole industry is, and you guys have been in it much longer than I, that's, you raise a great point. They're selling it like other kinds of software that you buy across your organization and within HR, where you're buying this to set it and forget it, to make it more efficient. And it just doesn't work when you're actually having it doing HR functions, because as you all know, each individual job description, each individual applicant, they have different requirements. And you have to go through it that granular, and that's just, a different way of how you design and purchase this software.
Keith, we've talked about the employer side this morning. I want to get a little freaky for a second. And things are going to get weird, all right? I mean,
It's already been pretty weird.
We're hiring robots in the metaverse,
Flippy.
people who are, they look like alligators and whatnot. We have AI that we can be a video personality that is not who we are, that may interview for us. People may interview and look like a woman of color and show up a white guy on day one. And like, this is going to happen. Does the EEOC have a North Star for this? Do they try to prepare for it? Like, how do you view the freakiness that is about to happen in technology from the job seeker side?
And make it short so we can at least get one question.
Yeah.
What kind of question is that?
You know me.
Yeah.
You know there's
Look,
got to be one
The bottom line
curveball.
is it's still going to be on you to have those policies and procedures in place to prevent fraud, right? Because applicants can't commit fraud against you, just like they can't say they went to Harvard when they didn't. They can't then show up on the metaverse.
Fraud's fraud.
Allegedly a person that looks a certain way to get the job and then show up somebody else. So, that's where the policies come in place that, if an applicant commits fraud using these tools, but that really goes on you setting the guardrails of what these tools can do.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions? One question when you don't have a lot of time. If not, we're just going to riff. And that's scary.
Come on, an EEOC commissioner.
Former.
Former. Yes, ma'am.
So in that example where somebody has an AI image but they show up as something,
See, I'm not the only
why did
one.
you do
I'm not
this?
the only one.
Carry on.
Yeah.
could you say they were not honest as the reason you didn't hire them?
In your process, you have to have those disclaimers in there that, first of all, I mean, I don't know how many tools allow you to do that, or if this is
Be
an
surprised,
issue
Keith.
down the road. It's really how you set the tone of using that kind of software to ensure that you're representing yourself. You're not doing anything that would mislead the employer to believe what your qualifications are, or goes across the board. But-
And think of it. I mean, there are people that are, and this is a very fringe case, okay? He's very fringy. So there are people that show up and do interviews for people, and then somebody else shows up. That's very fringe, right? We've had people taking SATs for people for how many years? I mean,
It's called fraud.
it's the same shit.
Yeah,
it's the same shit.
It's exactly right.
But there's a lawyer out there thinking about this.
I know.
Saying interview is a.
He's following ambulances, and
Yeah.
no, I totally get it.
Don't commit fraud. Let's just leave it there.
So at the end of the day, any more? No.
I'll ask another question. So can you give us some examples of situations where work from home was considered a reasonable accommodation?
Yeah, it's really dependent on the type of disability the employee. It's so granular, it's really tough. Where you really can't. There's no broad stroke approach to it. Like I said, that example too, where two employees are saying they have anxiety, but the type of anxiety and the type of differences are completely, the accommodation to be able to perform the job are different. And that's why all of you, it's going to take a lot of work to go in and work with the medical providers and work with your own medical providers. I'm sure through like your FMLA processes, you have third-party medical facilities that do those evaluations. It's really your appetite. And it's the same thing with religion. And having just gone through this, do you want to be in the business of questioning your employees' faith, even though the law allows you to challenge to see if they really believe what they believe? That's a lot of time and resources. Versus here too, where an employee wants to work from home, and it's related to PTSD, it's related to depression. You could take it at face value. And if that medical doctor or therapist, whoever they went to, saying this is the accommodation, you can just approve it, or you can say, we don't believe you, and we are going to send you to a third party, which you're allowed to do. The problem is it's just the inconsistent application, where you'll see, the friends of the managers will be able to work from home, and the people who actually may need to work from home don't get that accommodation because they don't trust them, they're not as good employees, and it always breaks down on racial differences, on gender differences, and that's where you can really get in trouble, not having those consistent policies of saying, look, we're going to challenge every request for accommodation, we're going to send to a third-party medical provider, and we'll let them work it out, or there's a lot of services that do this as well, versus we're going to do it on an individualized basis. So it's that consistent application, and that's more of a business decision that you need to work with outside of HR saying, how do we want to handle this? Do we just want to grant it, or do we want to actually go through our process to being able to see whether or not to challenge that?
What is your risk tolerance?
Yeah, exactly.
Keith, thanks for joining us today. For everyone out there that may have a question for you that they don't want to put out in public, they want to know more about what the EEOC is doing. I know they have some AI guidelines that might be helpful to them. Where should they
Just
go?
reach out on LinkedIn or wherever, or find me in the hall.
Let's hear it
Or
for
at the
Keith
airport.
Sonderling, everybody. We are the Chad and Cheese Podcast. Check us out at chadcheese.com. You can find Keith on LinkedIn. Thanks for everything.
We out.
We out.